Hey, it's Nathan. I want to start today with something a man who repairs church windows for a living told me once, because it has been rattling around in my head for weeks. He said glass never forgets a hand. Every pane that has ever been touched keeps a record of it. The oil, the pressure, the tiny bloom of a crack that starts as nothing and finishes as a shape you can date. His whole profession exists because materials are honest even when people are not. The story I'm about to tell you belongs to a father who built his life on that idea, and who found out the hard way that the people closest to you can spend years writing a version of events they expect you to sign. It starts with a phone call at 39,000 feet, over open water, from a stranger in a monitoring center who was watching a camera in a living room a father had installed for the most boring reason in the world. I want you to notice something as we go, because it's the actual lesson buried in here. This father did not win because he was the strongest man in the room. He wasn't in the room. He won because for 8 quiet months, while everyone around him was building a story, he had been building a record. And a record beats a story every single time. Let's get into it. Pierson Sanborn had spent 21 years learning to read light, and the first thing his father ever taught him about it was that light is a liar with an honest face. He was 9 when Ludwell Sanborn walked him into the north transept of a country church outside Hollybush, Virginia, on a February morning, and made him stand in front of a window that everyone in Sedgwick County agreed was beautiful. Ludwell asked him what he saw. Pierson said blue. His father said good. Now come back at 4 o'clock. At 4, the same window was gray and dead and slightly green, and a long diagonal fracture that had been invisible at 9 in the morning ran across the Virgin's hands like a scar. His father said, "That crack was there at 9, son. You just weren't standing where the light would tell you about it. That's the job. You don't restore what the window looks like. You restore what the window is." Sanborn Glass Conservation sat in a converted feed warehouse on Quarry Street with a 15-foot light table and a wall of numbered trays that held 4,000 fragments of other people's history. Ludwell founded it in 1961 with a diamond wheel, a kiln, and a temper. Pierson took it over in 2017, 4 months after his father died, with a lead knife still in his apron pocket, and by 43 he had a client list that read like a tour of the eastern seaboard: 3 cathedrals, a state capitol dome, 2 art museums. He was good in a specific and unglamorous way. He was patient past the point where other people found it comfortable. He photographed everything before he touched it, every pane, every came, every solder joint, from 4 angles with a scale bar, because his father had drilled into him that the only part of a restoration that survives the restoration is the documentation. 20 years of that had wired something into him. Pierson Sanborn's instinct, when a situation began to go strange, was not to raise his voice. It was to start a file. He had also spent 11 of those years 200 feet up, in a harness, in weather, working a spatula under glass that had not moved since Napoleon. He was not a soldier and never pretended to be, but he had the specific steadiness of a man whose profession punishes panic, and people who met him at parties tended to underestimate him in a way that had quietly worked in his favor his whole adult life. The best thing in his life was 9 years old and had a gap in her front teeth and an opinion about everything. Esme Sanborn had been born on a Tuesday in a thunderstorm and had been arguing with the weather ever since. She was the kind of kid who asked follow-up questions. When she was 4, she'd started coming to the studio on Saturdays, and Pierson had given her a corner of the light table and a coffee can of cullet, broken scrap glass, tumbled smooth, and she'd sort it by color for hours and hold pieces up to the window and narrate what the wall looked like through each one. By 7, she could tell flashed ruby from solid ruby by eye, which is genuinely difficult, and she had a laminated card in her pocket that said, in her own handwriting, "Esme Sanborn, Junior Conservator, ask me about lead." She had been 5.5 the first time she went away in the middle of a sentence. They were at the kitchen table. She was telling him about a bird. And then her spoon was on the floor, and her eyes were fixed on a point about a foot above the salt shaker, and her mouth was moving on nothing, and it lasted 40 seconds. And Pierson sat on the floor beside her and held the back of her head off the tile, and did not know yet that he would spend the rest of his life measuring things in 40-second increments. The diagnosis took 9 months and 2 hospitals and finally landed with Dr. Enid Bassey at Sheridan Children's in Roanoke, who put a hand flat on the table and said the 2 most useful sentences anyone said to them that year. The first was, "This is a manageable condition, and most of what you are afraid of is not going to happen." The second was, "It is manageable because of the medication, and it stops being manageable the day the medication stops." She said the word she wanted them to be afraid of, and she said it slowly so it would stick. Status epilepticus, a seizure that does not stop on its own. She told them that in a child, past about 5 minutes, you are no longer waiting. You are on a clock, and the clock is about brain and heart, and the only correct move is a phone call and an ambulance. By the time Esme was 7, the pills had turned her life ordinary again. 411 days between events, then 280. She swam. She rode a bike with a helmet her father had over-engineered. She kept a chart on the refrigerator with a gold star for every clean month, and she had filled out 3 rows of it, and the whole family had learned to breathe again. The whole family, that is, except the part of it that had decided the pills were the problem. Pierson had married Charity Chastain in a June ceremony in a tabernacle with clear glass windows, which he had privately found sad, and he had liked her enormously for 8 years. She had a way of making a room feel attended to. She was the youngest of the Chastains of Sabbath Hill, and in Sedgwick County that surname carried a specific weight, because for 31 years, her father had been the closest thing the county had to a celebrity. Obadiah Chastain was 71, 6'2", silver, and had a voice like a hand on your shoulder. He was not a pastor in the technical sense, no denomination, no seminary, no bishop, and he preferred it that way. He had built the First Light Fellowship out of a rented VFW hall in 1994 into a 900-seat tabernacle on top of Sabbath Hill, with a gravel lot that filled up on Sunday mornings, and a broadcast that went out to 40,000 people who had never set foot in Virginia. And what the fellowship was actually famous for, what filled that gravel lot, was children. Not a children's program. Children, sick children. 22 of them over 31 years that Obadiah Chastain had, on video, in front of witnesses, prayed over in the front room of the parsonage while their mothers wept, and who had afterward been declared well. The fellowship called them the testimonies, transferred from tape to disc to a streaming archive, and they were the engine of everything. Everyone ended the same way. A child sitting up, a brass bowl of water on the table, Obadiah's enormous hands lifting away, and his voice saying the line that got embroidered onto pillows all over the county. First Light does not need your permission. Pierson had watched 4 of them, early on, sitting on his in-law's sofa with a plate of ham on his knee, and he had said nothing at all, and Charity had squeezed his hand afterward like he'd passed a test. The trouble did not arrive as trouble. It arrived as kindness, which is how it usually gets in the door. It started the winter Esme turned 8, with Juanetta Chastain, Charity's mother, 68, soft-spoken, relentless, saying at a Sunday table that it broke her heart to watch a little girl take pills every day like an old woman. Nobody argued with her. That was the whole technique. Nobody in that family ever argued. They just kept saying the thing, gently, at every meal, for a year, until it became the temperature of the room. Then Obadiah began to preach about it, not about Esme, about fathers. There is a kind of man, he'd say, a good man, a decent provider, who trusts a bottle more than he trusts a hand, and the congregation would murmur. And Charity would sit very straight in the 3rd pew, with her hand around her daughter's shoulder, and Pierson, in from a job with drywall dust still in his hair, would sit beside her and understand with total clarity that a 900-seat room had just been told, without his name being used, that he was the obstacle. He did the thing he always did. He started a file. It was not dramatic. It was a folder on his laptop called Esme, Meds, and in it, beginning on the 9th of January, he put a photograph every single night of the weekly pill organizer with that day's compartment open, and a photograph of the bottle, and the count. 14 pills, 13, 12, 90 seconds a night. He did it because his father had taught him that a man who says, "I'm sure I gave it to her," has nothing, and a man with a dated photograph has everything. 8 months of 90 seconds. 240 photographs. He had no idea, in January, what he was building. He only knew that in his trade, when you can feel a draft you cannot see, you don't guess. You start marking where the cold is coming from. The first hard number came in March, from a pharmacy printout he had not gone looking for. Esme's prescription was a 30-day fill, and Pierson had picked it up himself for 4 years out of habit, the way he did the oil changes. That spring he'd been in Baltimore for 11 days, and Charity had picked it up instead. The bottle held 60 tablets, which was correct. The printout stapled to the bag was not. It listed the refill history, and it showed that in February a second fill had been collected 11 days early, at a different branch, in her name. He stood in his own kitchen and did the arithmetic twice. Somewhere in his house, or somewhere out of it, there were 30 days of his daughter's medication that had never gone into his daughter. He did not confront her. This is the part where most men lose, and he knew it, because he had watched his father lose exactly one argument in his life, with a committee that wanted a window done cheap, and the loss happened the moment Ludwell raised his voice and handed them a reason to stop listening. Pierson copied the printout. He photographed the bottle. He called the pharmacy and asked them, in the flattest voice he owned, to note the profile that both parents were to be contacted on any early fill, and to mail him the 12-month history. They did. He put it in the folder. Then he did the thing that mattered more than any of it. He took Esme to her April appointment, and at the end of it, when Dr. Bassi asked the routine question about whether she was taking her medication, he did not say fine. He said, "I want something in the chart." He said there was pressure in the family to stop the medication for religious reasons, that he did not consent to any interruption, and that he wanted it written in the note, dated, with a printed copy for him. Dr. Enid Bassi put her pen down and looked at him for a long moment. She was 51, Nigerian-born, Cleveland-trained, and she had a way of going completely still when she was deciding how frightened to be. Then she typed for 4 minutes, and she said, without looking up, "Mr. Sanborn, I need you to understand what a withdrawal looks like in a child who has been controlled for 2 years. It is not a return to how she was. Abrupt withdrawal is worse than never starting. The brain gets used to being held. When you take the hand away suddenly, it doesn't just fall, it panics. That is how you get a seizure that will not stop." And she wrote her cell number on the back of a card and pushed it across the desk and said, "If anything happens, do not call the office. Call me." He kept that card in the same pocket as his lead knife for 8 months. Esme, meanwhile, had started using a word she'd never used before. She used it in May, at bath time, in the middle of a story about a heron. She said, offhand, the way children hand you a live grenade, that Grandpa Obi said Wednesdays were fasting days now, and she wasn't supposed to tell. Pierson kept his hands in the water. He asked what fasting meant. She said it meant you skip. He asked skip what? She said, breakfast. And then she got very interested in the soap and said, and the little green ones, but only sometimes, and it's a secret because Daddy worries. He said calmly that it wasn't a secret from him and never had to be, and that if anybody ever asked her to keep a secret about her body from her father, that person was wrong, and she was never in trouble for telling him. He said it lightly. He said it 4 more times over the next 4 months, in different words, at different bath times, because he was building something in her too. Then he went out to the truck and sat in the dark with his hands on the wheel for 11 minutes, and shook, because he could feel the whole architecture of it now. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from realizing that the danger to your child is not a stranger. It's people with keys, people at your table, people whose casseroles are in your freezer. In June he moved, not loudly. There had been a break-in on Quarry Street in April, a truck window, a stolen nail gun, and Pierson used it as cover for something he'd wanted to do since May. He called a monitoring company out of Roanoke called Lanternside and had 4 cameras installed: driveway, back door, kitchen, living room. He told Charity it was the break-ins and the studio's insurance, which was even partly true. He set it up himself, because of course he did. The living room camera went high in the northwest corner, above the bookcase, on a bracket left over from a speaker he'd removed years earlier, angled to take in the whole room, including the fireplace and the front windows. He enabled the 2-way audio. He paid for 60-day cloud retention instead of 7, which cost $11 more a month. And he added a professional monitoring rider, the kind where a human being in a room somewhere watches an alert, instead of your phone getting a notification you'll see in the morning. The salesman asked him why a man with no history of burglary wanted human monitoring on an interior camera. Pierson had said, "Because I travel." In August, the fellowship announced Deliverance Sunday, and in the same week, Obadiah Chastain commissioned Sanborn Glass Conservation to build a window. The two things arrived together, in one conversation, on Obadiah's porch, over sweet tea, with the whole valley going gold behind him. Deliverance Sunday would be the 21st of September, 31 years to the day since the VFW Hall, and it would be the largest thing the fellowship had ever done. A live broadcast, a tent on the gravel lot, buses. And the centerpiece, the old man said, leaning forward, hands on his knees, was going to be a memorial window in the east wall of the tabernacle. 9 feet by 6, 22 panels, one for every child. He wanted his son-in-law to build it. He said it like a gift, and he watched Pierson's face while he said it, and Pierson understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his life reading light, exactly what was being done. It was a leash. Accept and you are inside the family. You are on the program. You are photographed shaking his hand, and your silence about pills becomes part of the deal. Refuse, and you are the man who wouldn't build a window for dead and healed children, and that story would be in every mouth in Sedgwick County by Wednesday. Pierson set down his glass. He said he'd be honored, and Obadiah Chastain smiled at him with genuine warmth, because he had won, and because the one thing that never occurred to him in 31 years of standing in front of 900 people was that somebody might say yes for reasons of their own. Pierson drove home and sat in the studio until 2 in the morning with a sketchbook, and what he drew that night was not the window he had been asked for. The Porto job came in on the 2nd of September, and he almost turned it down. It was 11 days, a chapel in the Ribera district with an 1878 rose window that had been badly leaded in 1961 and was buckling, and a consortium that had been chasing him for 2 years and would not wait. He'd be back on the 13th, 8 days before Deliverance Sunday, with the memorial window 90% built, and Joseph Cordas, 58, Krakow trained, 31 years at the studio, hands like a surgeon, and the temperament of a filing cabinet, finishing the leading in his absence. He put it to Esme first, which is how he made most decisions. She was very much in favor, because Portugal meant a present, and she negotiated hard for the present to be sea glass. Then he built the 11 days like a scaffold. He photographed the pill organizer and left it filled and dated on the counter with a printed schedule taped to the cabinet. He emailed Dr. Bassi his dates and his hotel and his cell, and she wrote back one line, "Keep your phone on." He walked across the street to Marilee Stubbs, 76, retired county clerk, a woman who had recorded deeds for 34 years and could not stop recording things, and asked her to keep an eye out. Marilee, who had privately disliked the Chastains since a 1998 dispute over a right-of-way, said she'd do better than that, and got out a spiral notebook. He checked the LanternSide app on the plane before takeoff. 4 cameras, green, 60-day retention, live view. And he told Charity, in the driveway, that he'd call every night at 7 her time, and she hugged him and said something about how good a quiet week would be, and he believed she meant it, because on the 2nd of September he still believed there was a version of this where nobody had to be destroyed. The first 4 nights were normal. Then, on the 6th, the video calls started dropping to voice. Bad signal at the house, Charity said. On the 7th, Esme sounded fogged and far away and said she was tired, and when he asked about school she said she hadn't gone, because of the tent. He asked what tent. She said, for Sunday. On the 8th he got no answer at all until 9:40, and then Charity picked up in a car with wind noise and said Esme was asleep at her mother's. On the 9th of September, Pierson Sanborn stood at a window in a rented room in Porto at 2 in the morning local time and opened the LanternSide app. He pulled the living room timeline back to the previous evening and watched 4 hours of his own house at high speed. At 8:14 p.m. Virginia time, his brother-in-law Holland Chastain came into the living room carrying a light stand, set it up, adjusted it, and left. At 8:31, DeWitt Chastain came in with a tripod, and at 8:52, on his own rug, In front of his own fireplace, somebody set down a brass bowl. He watched it 4 times. Then he closed the app and stood with his forehead against the cold glass of a window somebody else had made 300 years ago, and did the only calculation available to him. He was 5,000 miles away, with 4 days left on a contract he could not abandon without breaching it, and a daughter who was, right now, tonight, still walking around and talking. If he called and screamed, they would move whatever they were doing somewhere he had no cameras. If he flew home tomorrow, he'd arrive to a clean living room, a wife who would cry and say he was paranoid, and a father-in-law who would say, sadly, from a pulpit, that the poor man was unwell. And if he waited, if he let them build it, they would do it in front of a camera he had installed, and paid $11 extra a month to have a stranger watch. He hated himself for the next 4 days. He worked. He leaded a rose window in Portugal with his hands moving perfectly, and his mind 3,000 miles inside a living room. He called every night. He photographed nothing, changed nothing, said nothing. On the 11th, he wrote 1 email to Lanternside's operations desk, requesting written confirmation of his cloud retention period and the export procedure for a legal hold, and filed the reply. On the 13th of September, he finished the window 3 hours early, thanked the consortium, took a taxi to the airport, and boarded a red-eye to Newark with a bag of sea glass in his coat pocket. He would not make it to Newark. The call came in at 11:41 p.m. Eastern, which was 4:41 in the morning, where his body still was, 39,000 feet over the Atlantic, roughly 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland, in seat 14C, with a paper cup of water going flat on the tray table. The plane had the kind of expensive satellite Wi-Fi that actually works, and Pierson has said since that he thinks about that more than almost anything else about the night, that the whole outcome of his daughter's life pivoted on a $14 internet purchase made out of boredom at a boarding gate in Portugal. His phone lit with a Roanoke area code, and he answered it, because a man with a 9-year-old answers unknown numbers at midnight. The voice was young, male, careful, and stripped of every ounce of small talk. It said, "Mr. Sanborn, this is Marcel with Lanternside Monitoring. I'm on your account. I need you to open your app and look at your living room camera right now." "Sir, right now," Pierson said. "Tell me what you're seeing." And Marcel Duplantis, 29, 4 hours into a night shift in a windowless room in a business park outside Roanoke, said the sentence that Pierson Sanborn will hear for the rest of his life. He said, "Sir, there is a child on the floor, and I don't think she's breathing right, and there are 5 adults in the room, and nobody is calling anybody." Then he said, "I think your daughter is in danger." The clip was 41 seconds long. Pierson watched it 11 times in the next 9 minutes, and later a federal prosecutor would play it to a grand jury, and later still Pierson would sit in a windowless room and describe every frame of it in a flat voice, and the court reporter would have to ask him twice to slow down. This is what was on it. The living room of a house on Quarry Street, Hollybush, Virginia, from a camera mounted high in the northwest corner. Timestamp 11:37 p.m. The good rug rolled halfway back. A photography light on a stand, gelled warm, aimed down at the floor. On the floor, on a green wool blanket that Pierson recognized because his own mother had made it, Esme Sanborn, 9 years old, in her nightgown, on her side, rigid, both arms drawn in, her head turned away from the camera, and her jaw locked. Kneeling at her head, both hands pressed flat on her temples, Obadiah Chastain, in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, his mouth moving steadily and evenly. To his left, a brass bowl of water. Behind them, tilted in, a camera on a tripod, and Holland Chastain crouched behind it with his eye to the finder. To the right, at the edge of frame, DeWitt Chastain holding a phone horizontally as a monitor, checking the shot, adjusting the light a half step. Standing back by the couch with a folded towel in both hands, absolutely still, looking at the floor and not at her daughter's face, Charity. And on the mantel, in frame, in focus, the clock they'd been given at their wedding, reading 11:37. At the 29-second mark of the clip, Esme's right arm came loose from her body and hit the floor and did not come back, and her breathing changed audibly on the microphone, a sound Pierson knew from a kitchen when she was 5 and a half, And Obadiah Chastain leaned in closer and pressed harder and raised his voice, and Holland Chastain said, clearly, in the flat professional tone of a man doing a job, "Hold that. I lost focus. Hold that." Nobody in the room moved toward a telephone. Pierson Sanborn did not scream. He has been asked about that in 3 depositions and 1 interview, and his answer has never changed. He said that somewhere around the 4th viewing, something in him that had been standing up for 8 months quietly sat down, and what was left was a man on a job site with a problem, a clock, and a set of tools, and no time to feel anything. He looked at the clip and made a list. She was in status. It had been going since 11:29 at the latest, because the light was already set and the rug was already rolled, and nobody sets up a light in 8 minutes. That was 12 minutes and counting on the clock Dr. Bassi had drawn for him in a Roanoke office 4 years earlier. 5 minutes to a phone call, 10 to real damage, past 20, and you are talking about a child who does not come all the way back. The people in the room were not going to call. They were not going to call because a 911 call creates a record that says a child had a medical emergency, and the entire product being manufactured on that rug required that no such record exist. They needed the seizure to stop, and to stop while the old man's hands were on her. And they had 31 years of experience of it stopping, because a seizure almost always stops. Almost. He also understood, in the same breath, why she was seizing at all, and it made his hands cold. He had photographed that pill organizer for 240 nights. He knew what a 9-day gap looked like. Wednesdays were fasting days. What was in her blood tonight was nothing, and that was not an accident, and it was not neglect. It was a schedule. Somebody had been building up to Sunday. He pressed the call button. The flight attendant who came had 30 years in the air. Pierson turned his phone around and let her watch 9 seconds, and she went the color of paper and said, "I'll get the purser." While he waited, he did the first thing. He did not call 911. It is the decision people argue about, and it is the decision that saved his daughter. A 911 call from a man 5,000 miles away, about a house whose owner is not present, in a county where the man inside that house is the most influential person in it, produces a welfare check. A welfare check produces a deputy at a door, and that door would be opened by a 71-year-old in a white shirt with a bowl of water and a granddaughter now sleeping peacefully on a couch. The deputy, Sedgwick County had 11 of them, and Pierson could have told you which pew 4 of them sat in, would apologize for the intrusion and write it up as unfounded. The light stand would be in the truck before he reached the end of the driveway. Esme's blood would be drawn by nobody, and by Tuesday every measurement in her body would be meaningless, because they'd have started giving her the pills again the second the taillights hit the road. He needed this to be a medical event, not a police event. He needed an ambulance whose crew answered to a medical director and not a sheriff. He needed her taken out of Sedgwick County, and he needed a specific list of blood drawn at a specific hospital before anybody put a single tablet back into his daughter. He made one call. Dr. Enid Bassi answered on the 4th ring at 11:48 p.m. from her own bed and said his name before he said anything, because there is only one reason a father calls that number. He talked for 90 seconds. He did not editorialize, because he understood he was talking to somebody who needed data, not outrage. He gave her the clip's timestamp, the estimated onset, the last confirmed dose he could personally verify, the 29th of August, before he flew, the address, the fact that there were 5 adults in the room and no phone call, and the sentence that made her get out of bed and start putting on shoes with the phone against her shoulder. I have photographic documentation of a 9-day pattern, and I have a pharmacy printout, and if she gets loaded with medication before anyone draws a level, I lose the only proof that exists. Dr. Bassi said, "Send me the video. Stay on this line." Then she did 4 things in 11 minutes, and every one of them mattered. She called the Sedgwick County EMS medical control line she had privileges to, as the on-call specialist for a patient in the region, and used the words that convert a soft dispatch into a hard one. Not welfare check, not possible seizure. She said, pediatric status epilepticus, known epilepsy, presumed medication non-compliance, ongoing greater than 15 minutes, advanced life support response. And she requested transport to Sheridan Children's in Roanoke, rather than the closer county hospital, on the grounds of pediatric neurology capability, which was medically true and which also happened to move a 9-year-old girl 38 miles out from under her grandfather's county. She called the charge nurse in her own emergency department and had a bed and a lab order queued before the ambulance left its bay, a serum medication level drawn on arrival, before the loading dose if clinically possible, a metabolic panel, lactate, creatine kinase, and photographic documentation of the skin of the wrists, forearms, and temples. She called the state's child abuse and neglect hotline herself, as a mandated reporter, and gave Pierson a report number to write down, because a report made by a physician to a state hotline cannot be absorbed by a county. And at midnight she called Dr. Sumiko Nakagawa, the child abuse pediatrician on the Sheridan service, and said one sentence, "I need you in tonight, and bring the camera." The purser came back with the captain's answer while Pierson was still on the line. Halifax was closer than either Newark or Newfoundland, a long runway, and customs at that hour. The captain, a woman with grown children who had watched the same 9 seconds, declared a passenger medical family emergency and put the aircraft on the ground at Halifax Stanfield at 1:06 a.m. Atlantic time. Pierson was off that aircraft with a cabin bag and a bag of sea glass and nothing else, and at 1:20 in the morning, in an empty terminal, he did the second thing, which was money. He called the charter broker his studio used to move glass, because a 9-foot lancet panel from 1878 does not travel by freight, and Sanborn Glass Conservation had put years of business through a small company in Manassas that flew art. He woke a man out of bed, said, "Personal, tonight, whatever it costs," and read out a credit card number he had never once come close to maxing. There was a citation in Halifax, on a repositioning leg, quoted at $19,400. He said yes before the man finished the sentence. And then, standing at a dark window in a Canadian terminal with the phone hot against his ear, he did the third thing, the one that people who hear this story never forget. He opened the Lanternside app, went to the living room camera, and pressed the two-way audio button. 240 photographs, 8 months of 90 seconds a night. He had built one more thing into that house without telling anybody, and it was a voice. In a living room in Hollybush, Virginia, at 12:24 a.m., out of a small speaker mounted high in the northwest corner above the bookcase, in a room containing 5 adults, a camera on a tripod, a photography light, a brass bowl, and a 9-year-old girl on a green blanket, Pierson Sanborn's voice said, "This is Pierson. I am watching. Every second of this room for the last 60 days is on a server that is not in this house and not on your phones. An ambulance is coming for my daughter, and I know exactly what time you stopped calling anyone. Step away from her." Marcel Duplantis, in a windowless room outside Roanoke, was watching the same feed, and he has said in a sworn statement that he saw all 5 adults look up at the corner of the ceiling at the same instant, and that Holland Chastain's first movement was not toward the child on the floor, it was toward the tripod. He also stated, and the time-stamped log confirmed it, that at 12:24:31, someone attempted to log into the Lanternside account from an unrecognized device and failed, and that at 12:25:02, someone unplugged the router, and that this accomplished exactly nothing, because 60 days of that living room had already been sitting on a server in Ashburn for weeks, and because Pierson had, 4 hours earlier from a rented room in Porto, submitted a written request for a legal hold on the account. By the time the router came out of the wall, the ambulance was 6 minutes away. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the phone call, at 2:21 in the morning, Obadiah Chastain was standing in a hospital corridor 38 miles from the county he had run for 31 years, being asked a question he had never in his life been asked out loud. What happened between the ambulance and that corridor is the part of this story Pierson did not see and had to reconstruct afterward from 4 sworn statements, a run sheet, and a spiral notebook belonging to a 76-year-old woman. The ambulance out of Hollybush Station arrived at 12:31 a.m. An ALS unit, 2 paramedics, dispatched under the words Dr. Bassi had used, which meant they came in loaded for a fight and not for a chat. The lead medic was Dwayne Struble, 38, 11 years on the box, a large, calm man who had grown up 4 miles away and had, incidentally, sat in the fourth pew of Sabbath Hill Tabernacle every Sunday of his childhood until he was 19 and had stopped, and had never told his mother exactly why. The front door was answered by Juanetta Chastain, who said, pleasantly, that there had been a misunderstanding, that the child was resting, and that they would not be needing an ambulance. Struble stated in his deposition that he said, "Once, ma'am, step aside," and then stepped past her, because a dispatched pediatric status call is not a conversation, and because through the doorway he could see, on a green blanket on the floor of a living room with a photography light knocked over beside it, a 9-year-old girl who was postictal, unresponsive to voice, and whose lips were the wrong color. He also stated that the room smelled of hot lamp, that there was a brass bowl of water on the rug, and that a man in a white shirt stood between him and the child with both hands raised, saying, "We have this in hand, son. She is coming out of it," and that he moved him with a forearm and did not consider it a difficult decision. Esme Sanborn's oxygen saturation on room air was 88%. Her blood sugar was 51. Her temperature was 103.1. Her right pupil was slow. She had a bitten tongue and 4 fingertip-shaped bruises on each temple, and one of the paramedics photographed those on his phone in the driveway before she was loaded, on Struble's instruction, not protocol, and later described by the prosecution as the single most valuable act of any first responder in the case. Charity Sanborn rode up front, as she was entitled to do, and spent the trip telling the driver that her daughter had a history of fever events, that her husband was unstable and currently overseas, and that none of this was necessary. Obadiah Chastain followed in his own car. Holland Chastain did not follow. Holland Chastain went back into the house, and Marilee Stubbs, across the street in a bathrobe with a notebook and a pair of drugstore reading glasses, wrote down that at 12:52 a.m., a man carried 2 black bags and a light stand out of the Sanborn house, put them in a white pickup, and drove away. She wrote down the license plate, because she had recorded deeds for 34 years and old habits are a gift. Sheriff Bascom Mulkey arrived at the house at 1:10 a.m., after everyone had left, and stood in the driveway for 6 minutes, and made a phone call, and left, and wrote nothing. At Sheridan Children's, at 1:19 a.m., they went to work. She was loaded with a benzodiazepine in the truck and a second-line agent in the department. But before either, in the 11-second window between the IV going in and the drug going up, because a charge nurse had a lab tube in her hand and a physician's standing order in the chart from 80 minutes earlier, they drew her blood. The result posted at 2:14 a.m. Esme Sanborn's serum level of the medication she had been prescribed every day for 4 years. The medication her father had photographed 240 times. The medication a pharmacy in Hollybush had dispensed on schedule every 30 days without interruption, was reported as none detected. Not low, not subtherapeutic, none. A blood level cannot be prayed over, argued with, or preached at. It is glass at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It shows you the crack that was there all along. Dr. Sumiko Nakagawa arrived at 1:40 with a camera and a ruler and a body diagram form and photographed 41 images, the temples, the wrists, where there were parallel linear marks consistent with being held, the tongue, the knees. She measured the bruises. She noted their color and therefore their age, and she noted, in a sentence that would be read aloud in a courtroom 11 months later, that the fingertip contusions at the temples were of at least 2 distinct ages, which meant this had not been the first time hands had held that child's head down. And at 2:21 a.m., in the corridor outside Bay 9, Dr. Enid Bassey, who had driven in at midnight in the clothes she'd grabbed off a chair, stood in front of Obadiah Chastain, who was 6 inches taller than her and had a voice like a hand on your shoulder, and asked him, in front of a charge nurse, a security officer, and a resident who would all later be deposed, "Sir, this child's blood contains none of her medication. I have your fellowship's own photographs of you handing her a pill bottle in June, so I would like you to tell me, on the record, where the medication went." The recording of that corridor exists because Sheridan Children's records its emergency department corridors, and because Dr. Bassey knew that, and because she had positioned herself accordingly. Obadiah Chastain said, "I don't answer to you." Then he said, and this is the 11 words that ended him, "The child was under a covering. The pills were a compromise." At 2:21 a.m. Eastern, Pierson Sanborn was at 39,000 feet again, in a citation with cream leather and one other person on board, over the state of Maine, with his phone on the armrest and a text on the screen from Dr. Bassie that said, "She is out of it. She is going to be all right." Level came back 0. Get here. He read it 4 times. Then he turned his face to the window, and for the first time since 11:41 p.m., for about 90 seconds, Pierson Sanborn came apart. Then he wiped his face with the heel of his hand, took out a notebook, and began to write down everything he was going to need. He landed in Roanoke at 5:38 a.m. and was at his daughter's bedside at 6:04, and she woke at 7:20 and looked at him for a long time and then said, thickly, around a bitten tongue, "Did you get the glass?" He said he got the glass. He put a piece of it in her hand, sea tumbled green, and she held it up to the window where the sun was coming over the parking deck, and looked through it, and said the light was doing something funny, and went back to sleep holding it. Then Pierson Sanborn went down to the family lounge, opened a laptop, and started work. What he did over the next 11 weeks is the reason this story does not end with a judge splitting the difference between 2 versions of one night. He did not build a defense. He built a restoration report, a specific document with a specific structure, which he had written 400 times in his career, and which is designed to prove, to people who will never see the object, exactly what was done to it, by whom, in what order, and when. He started with the 60 days. The Lanternside export ran to 911 gigabytes and covered the 15th of July to the 14th of September. Pierson watched all of it. Not skimmed, watched, at 4 times speed, with a pad, for 19 days, 11 hours a day. He built an index, time, date, who was in the room, what was in the room. What the index showed was not 1 night, it showed 9. 9 evenings between the 18th of July and the 13th of September, on which a light stand came into his living room. 9 on which a brass bowl was placed on the rug. 6 on which a camera went on a tripod. 4 on which Esme Sanborn had a seizure in front of it. And this was the one he had to stand up and walk around the room after finding. On 22 separate occasions, Charity Sanborn opened the weekly pill organizer on the kitchen counter, removed that day's tablet, and put it in the pocket of her cardigan. She had not thrown them away. She had pocketed them, every time, in view of a camera her husband had told her about. He put those 22 clips beside his own 240 nightly photographs, and beside the pharmacy's 12-month dispensing history, and the 3 of them produced 1 line on 1 page. From January to September, this child was dispensed 248 days of medication, and received, at most, 181, with the gaps falling in clusters of 7 to 9 days, each cluster ending on a date when a light stand entered the room. A pattern is not an accident. A pattern is a plan with a calendar. Then he went at the archive, and this is where a glass conservator became something nobody in Sedgwick County had anticipated. The testimonies, 22 videos, 31 years, VHS to DVD to a members-only streaming page that cost $9 a month, were the fellowship's product, its proof, and its fundraising engine. Pierson bought a membership under his own name, which he later called the most satisfying $9 he ever spent, and downloaded all 22. He watched them the way he'd watch a window, not for the picture, for the fabric. The front room of the parsonage appears in 19 of the 22. Same fireplace, same brass bowl, dented on the left rim since at least 2004. Same table, and behind the old man's right shoulder, in all 19, a window. Pierson had restored that window. In June of 2019, Sanborn Glass Conservation was paid $2,900 to repair storm damage to the parsonage's front room casement. 5 lights of 19th-century quarry glass, diamond panes, lead cames. Pierson did the work himself over 4 days. And because he was Ludwell Sanborn's son, he photographed every pane from 4 angles with a scale bar, before and after, and wrote a condition report numbering each of the 42 quarries, noting that pane 17, second row, 3rd from left, had a distinctive S-curve fracture he had edge-glued rather than replace, because the glass was original and the crack was stable, and you do not throw away 1874 glass to make a picture tidy. He had also, on the 14th of June 2019, replaced pane 31, which had been shattered, with a piece of period salvage, very slightly greener than its neighbors, with a single small seed bubble near its lower edge, which means every frame of video ever shot in that room carries a date stamp built out of glass. Before June 2019, pane 31 is broken, or boarded, or old glass with a different striation. After, it is greener, with a bubble. And pane 17's fracture appears, or doesn't, or has grown by an amount Pierson could measure against his own dated photographs to within about 4 millimeters. And because cracks in glass grow one direction only and never heal, that gave him a crude but genuinely unfakeable timeline. He spent 2 weeks on it and built a chart, 22 videos, 19 with the window visible, each assigned an earliest and latest possible date from the glass alone. 6 of them were lying. 6 testimonies presented on the fellowship's page with dates between 2011 and 2016 showed pane 31 in its post-2019 form, which meant they had been shot after June 2019 and backdated, which meant the fellowship had been reshooting old miracles, restaging them, with children, in the same room, with the same bowl, and presenting them as archival, to keep the donation engine fed through years when there had not been enough sick children to go around. And one of them, used in 11 separate fundraising appeals, showed a 5-year-old boy named Noble Weathersby sitting up on that green blanket. Its earliest possible date from the glass was July 2019. Noble Weathersby died in April 2021. The video presented as the record of his healing had been shot 21 months before his death, and the fellowship had gone on mailing it out, in envelopes, with a reply card, for 4 years after he was in the ground. That was the moment Pierson Sanborn stopped thinking about his marriage and started thinking about a federal statute. A contracts lawyer referred him to Sigrid Vondra, 49, who did family law and had spent 6 years before that at a state attorney general's office. She listened for 2 hours and then said, "Mr. Sanborn, you've brought me 2 cases. The first is your daughter, and we will win it. The second isn't a family case at all. The second one goes in the mail." The envelopes were the key, and Vondra saw it before he did. The Lampstand Fund, the Fellowship's Benevolence Fund, established 1996, solicited by mail. 4 appeals a year, a printed letter over Obadiah Chastain's signature, a photograph of a child, a reply envelope. In 31 years, it had taken in $4,100,000, stated purpose the medical and household needs of the families of healed children. Its actual disbursements, filed with the state because they had to be, showed that in 9 years it had paid $211,000 to families and $1,900,000 in ministry administration, the largest line being a lease on the parsonage property, held by an entity called Sabbath Hill Trust, whose sole trustee was Obadiah Chastain. And in 2 cases, a girl in 2013 and a boy in 2018, both of whom had received settlements after medical injuries, the fund's counsel had successfully petitioned for guardianship of the child's money with Obadiah Chastain as conservator, $640,000 into accounts he controlled. A charitable solicitation containing a knowingly false statement sent through the United States mail is mail fraud. 22 counts of it sat in a filing cabinet in a tabernacle on a hill, and every one of them had a stamp on it. Postal Inspector Terrence Lamott returned Vondra's call in 3 days and drove down from Richmond on the 4th. 53. Windbreaker. 11 pages of notes. He asked exactly one question about the glass. "Can you put a number on the error bar?" Pierson said 4 millimeters. Lamott wrote it down and underlined it twice, and Pierson understood he was talking to a man who had spent a career being lied to and had developed a taste for things that could be measured. The last piece walked into the studio on her own. Selah Amberg was 22, had a 2-year audio certificate, and had run the broadcast board at Sabbath Hill Tabernacle for 3 years for $600 a month, because it was the only sound job in the county. She came to Quarry Street on a Tuesday in October with a hard drive in a grocery bag, stood inside the door, and said she'd been sick to her stomach for 11 months and didn't know who to give it to. The live stream was mixed live, but Selah, being properly trained and slightly obsessive, had always recorded the multitrack. Every microphone, unmixed, unedited, including the lavalier on Obadiah Chastain, which was live from the moment he clipped it on in the vestry to the moment he took it off. 19 months, 411 hours. What is on a preacher's lavalier before the stream starts is not a sermon. It is a man in a back room talking to his sons. On the 17th of August, at 9:41 in the morning, 40 seconds of it went like this. Obadiah Chastain, close, casual, unbothered. Where are we on the girl? Holland, 6 days. Obadiah, make it 9. 9 is when it goes strong. 6 is a stumble and it looks like nothing. Holland, Charity's soft on it. Obadiah, then don't ask her, just count. 9 is when it goes strong. Pierson listened to that clip 40 times, then went out behind the studio and put his fist through the sheet metal of an old kiln housing, the only violent thing he did in the entire affair, and one he has never apologized for. Then he came back inside and made copies, one for Inspector Lamotte, one for Sigrid Vondra, one for Dr. Nakagawa, one for the state's guardian ad litem, and one for the fireproof box with his father's lead knife. The fellowship's counterattack came on the 2nd of November, and it was very good, which is what happens when an organization has been managing narratives for 31 years. They did not attack the video, they attacked the father. There was a letter, mailed to 11,000 addresses over Obadiah Chastain's signature, about a family in crisis and a son-in-law who had been unwell for some time, a man who had put surveillance cameras in his own house to watch his wife, who had refused his child's healing out of pride, who had abandoned that child to fly to Europe the very week she fell ill. There was a 9-minute video on the fellowship's page in which Pierson Sanborn sat in a chair with her hands in her lap and cried and said she was afraid of her husband, that he had photographed her, and that she wanted people to pray for him. And there was a psychologist, Dr. Fenton Sturm, 62, who had never met Pierson Sanborn, who produced 4 pages about coercive documenting behavior and surveillance as control, and who had been paid $9,000 out of the lampstand fund under a line item marked Family Services. For about 6 days it worked. The county turned. Pierson lost 2 clients. A church in Lynchburg canceled a survey, and a woman at the hardware store told him to his face that she was ashamed for him. Marilee Stubbs got a brick through her front window with nothing wrapped around it, which is somehow worse. And at the custody hearing on the 9th of November, Sheriff Bascom Mulkey testified under oath, in a blue suit, that he had personally responded to the residents that night, found no evidence of any emergency, and that the child had appeared to be sleeping. He had arrived at 1:10 a.m., after the ambulance was gone, and stood in an empty driveway for 6 minutes. Sigrid Vondra let him finish. Then she asked him to confirm the time of his arrival, then whether he had entered the house. Then she introduced the ambulance run sheet showing departure at 12:58, the dispatch log showing his own unit arriving at 1:10, and the driveway camera, because Pierson had installed 4 cameras, and one of them pointed at the driveway, and it showed the sheriff standing in an empty gravel driveway making a phone call for 6 minutes and 11 seconds while there was nobody at all inside the house. Then she introduced his phone records. The call was to Obadiah Chastain's cell, and it lasted 4 minutes. Judge Philomena Barbie granted Pierson sole legal and physical custody that afternoon, with the mother's contact supervised and conditioned on treatment. She also referred the sheriff's testimony to the Commonwealth's attorney, which became a perjury charge in January, and his resignation in March. Pierson Sanborn broke in a deposition on the 19th of December, in the 11th hour of questioning across 2 days, and it was not the video that did it, and it was not the audio. It was a drawing. Esme had been drawing since she came home from the hospital, compulsively, mostly the same thing. A room from a low angle, a fireplace, a light on a stand, and a window behind a man with no face. Dr. Nakagawa collected 19 of them, and in every single one, the child had drawn that window, 5 lights, diamond panes, and in every single one, she had drawn one pane greener than the others, with a bubble in it, because she had spent 4 years of Saturdays at a light table with her father learning to see exactly that. His 9-year-old had independently dated the room. When that was laid in front of her mother, 19 crayon drawings, and beside them her husband's 2019 condition report on pane 31. Charity stopped talking for a long time. Then she said, "On the record, I counted the days. He told me to count them and I counted them, and I want to say it out loud." She pleaded and cooperated, and the prosecution used her, and she got a sentence a lot of people thought was light and that Pierson Sanborn has never once commented on publicly. Asked about it in the only interview he ever gave, he said, "She was 30 years inside that room before she ever met me. I got her out in 11 weeks, and I'm not proud of the 11 weeks." Deliverance Sunday had been postponed from September to the 14th of March, and the fellowship went ahead with it, because Obadiah Chastain understood that a movement that cancels is a movement that ends. It was defiance staged as worship, 900 seats, a tent on the lot, buses from 3 states, a live broadcast, and the dedication of the memorial window in the east wall. Pierson Sanborn delivered that window on the 11th of March, on time, under contract, invoiced and paid. 9 feet by 6. 22 panels. He and Joseph Cordes installed it themselves over 2 days with the sanctuary curtained off, as specified, and Obadiah Chastain did not look at it, because he had decided the reveal would be a moment, and moments must be protected. Here is what nobody in that building knew. A leaded window is an assembly. Each panel of glass sits in a lead came. The came is soldered. The whole thing is puttied and cleaned, and to anyone who is not a glazier, it is a finished, sealed, permanent object. To a glazier, it is a set of pockets. Behind each of the 22 figurative panels, Pierson had set a second, thinner light, an interlayer of flashed opal glass, acid etched about a millimeter deep with a name and 2 dates. Etched glass is very nearly invisible when light passes straight through it. It only appears when light strikes it at an angle and scatters. The east wall of Sabbath Hill Tabernacle faces 101 degrees. Pierson had measured it in 2019 while repairing the parsonage. On the 14th of March, the sun clears the ridge behind the tabernacle at 7:51 and crosses the plane of that wall at an angle of about 11 degrees at 9:52 in the morning. The dedication was scheduled, in the printed program, for 9:45. At 9:44, the curtain came down, and 900 people made the sound people make, because it was a beautiful window. 22 children in ordinary clothes, hands open, in glass, the color of a field in October. The broadcast cut to a wide shot. Obadiah Chastain stood beneath it in a white shirt, raised both hands, and began to speak about children, and light, and permission. At about 9:51, the room started to change color. At 9:52, as the sun came around and struck the east wall at 11 degrees, 22 names lit up inside the glass. They were not printed on it. They were in it, floating in the middle depth of each panel like something underwater, in letters 9 inches high, and every one of them had 2 dates. 19 of them read born and healed. 3 of them read born and died. Enoch Teasley, 1998, 2009. Amity Loach, 2008, 2015. Noble Weathersby, 2016, 2021. And across the bottom rail, in a band Obadiah Chastain had approved as decorative ornament from a shop drawing, and which had contained on that drawing only a line of abstract quatrefoils, there were now 9 words in the same ghost lettering, and they were his own. 9 is when it goes strong. Then don't ask her. The broadcast ran another 2 minutes and 11 seconds before somebody in the booth found the cut. Selah Amberg was not at the board that morning. She was in the 4th row beside Wilma Teasley, Enoch's sister, 31, who had been telling people in Sedgwick County what happened to her brother since she was 14, and had been called a bitter girl for 17 years, and who stood up when the names came on and did not say anything at all. 900 people read 3 dates in a window. Then they turned and looked at the man standing under it. He kept talking for about 40 seconds. That is the part Pierson says he thinks about, not the arrest, the 40 seconds. A professional finishing his sentence into a room that had stopped being his. Inspector Lamott and 2 agents took Obadiah Chastain in the vestry at 10:20 a.m., between the dedication and the offering, with the lavalier still clipped to his collar, which meant the audio of his own arrest went onto the fellowship's own multitrack, which Selah Amberg had set to record that morning out of habit, and handed over that afternoon. He was convicted on 19 counts of mail fraud, 3 of wire fraud, 2 of aggravated identity theft on the guardianships, and, in a separate state prosecution that Dr. Nakagawa's 41 photographs carried almost by themselves, felony child abuse and neglect, plus 1 count of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Noble Weathersby, whose mother testified for 9 minutes and asked the court one question: whether anybody had ever counted her son's days for him. He was sentenced to 288 months. He was 72 years old. Holland Chastain got 106 months. DeWitt Chastain cooperated in the 11th hour and got 41. Juanetta Chastain was never charged and moved to South Carolina. Dr. Fenton Sturm surrendered his license. The Lampstand Fund was dissolved, and its remaining $1,100,000 went into a court-supervised restitution fund for the medical costs of the 19 surviving children, administered, at Pierson Sanborn's written request, without $1 of it going to him. The Tabernacle could not sell the building with the window in it, and could not remove the window, because the Commonwealth had entered it into evidence as an exhibit. After the trial, a preservation trust bought the building for $1 and turned the sanctuary into a reading room for the county library. The window is still in the east wall. Nothing happens to it most of the day. At 9:52 in the morning, 22 names come up out of nowhere and then go away again, and people drive out from 4 counties to sit on a folding chair and watch that happen. Esme Sanborn is 11 now. She has been seizure-free for 409 days, which is a personal record, and there is a new chart on a new refrigerator with a great many gold stars on it. She testified once, on video, for 6 minutes, and has not been asked to talk about it since. On Saturdays, she still sorts cullet at the light table in the converted feed warehouse on Quarry Street. She has a new laminated card in her pocket. She made it herself, and it says, "Esme Sanborn, conservator, ask me about light." She asked her father once, that first winter, why the names only came at 9:52. He said, because that's when the light finally hits it right. He said the names were in the glass the whole time. Everybody in that room was looking straight at them for 7 minutes and couldn't see a thing because they were standing in the wrong place. She thought about that for a while. Then she held up a piece of green glass and looked at him through it and said, "So you have to move." He said, "That's the whole job." So, Nathan again. Here's what actually got me about this one, and it isn't the window. The window is the fireworks. The real story is 240 photographs. Think about how boring that is. A man stands in his kitchen every night for 8 months and takes a picture of a plastic pill organizer. 90 seconds. No confrontation, no speech, no moment where he slams a door and everybody finally sees how right he was. Just a dated photograph, over and over, while people he loved sat at his table, building a story that required him to be crazy. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being gaslit by a family. You cannot win that fight by arguing, because arguing is the game they're good at, and you are outnumbered at every table. There were 5 adults in that living room. 5. Any one of them could have picked up a phone, and not one did. Because when a group of people agrees on a story, the story becomes more real to them than the child on the floor. You beat that with a record, not a feeling. A record. Something dated. Something outside your own house. Something that exists whether or not anyone believes you. A time-stamped photograph. A note in a medical chart. A pharmacy printout. A neighbor with a spiral notebook. A camera you paid $11 extra a month to have a stranger watch. None of it looks like courage while you're doing it. All of it looks like paranoia. Right up until the night it's the only reason your kid is alive. And the other half, he built a record in his daughter too. Every bath time, 4 months running. Nobody gets to ask you to keep a secret about your body from me, and you are never in trouble for telling. That's the sentence that got her drawing pictures instead of hiding. Say it to the kids in your life. Say it boringly, and often. Records outlive stories. Glass remembers every hand that ever touched it, and sometimes all you have to do to see what was there the whole time is stand somewhere else. I'm Nathan. Thanks for staying to the end.